something that was expected amongst basketball fans, just who pay attention kind of to the conversation around a little bit on every team around the league, was that Nick Nurse was going to be fired. And now we hear that Ime Udoka may be the leading candidate to replace him. We're going to talk about all that and more right after this.
Welcome to the number one place for your daily basketball news and analysis, NBA Central.
Welcome to another episode of NBA Central. I'm one of the hosts here, Haize, holding it down for the channel. Make sure you guys follow me at CEO Haize. You can also follow the show at NBA Central Pod on every social media platform that we're on. But let's go ahead and get into the content for today. So Nick Nurse was fired by the Toronto Raptors today, and this brings an end to a 5-year stretch of him running that team. In that stretch of time, he's had an over 50% record, winning 58% of his games. He was the 2019 NBA champion and the 2019-20 Coach of the Year. What does all that mean? It just highlights the fact that in this league, it really comes down to what have you done for me lately? This is a guy who won a title, right? Who had an above 500 record, who really did, despite some things and issues with that team and losing Kawhi Leonard, who was a one-year rental, and just seeing that franchise go through some change, Scottie Barnes coming in there, having what people look at as a down season for Scottie Barnes, but really isn't. He just didn't make the leap that people thought. But again, he's 21 years old. But this sends the Toronto Raptors into an offseason where they have some tough decisions to make. Now, whoever's going to be the next head coach is probably the biggest question to come up for that, and that's fine, right? When you look at that. But then there are other questions around it. Around the trade deadline this year, it was commonly thought and expected that maybe the Toronto Raptors were going to make a move to kind of break up some of that. They have a lot of players that are all long, athletic, tall, have good wingspans, things like that, but that don't really have that one great offensive skill set. You got a lot of talent down there. And so there was some thought that, maybe the Toronto Raptors were going to break that up at the trade deadline last year. They did not. They decided to punt it, and they keep it going. And so now they fire their head coach, Nick Nurse. And Masai Ujiri, I think that's how you pronounce his name, came out and said that you don't have to tear your team down to rebuild it. And I think that may point to the direction that this franchise is going to go in, right? And so, you bring in potentially Ime Udoka, who seems to be the top candidate right now to come in and take over the Toronto Raptors job. And I like to look at that. I like when you look at what Ime did in Boston, right? And just how that roster was made up, right? Having two players, forwards down there, and Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, who kind of had to figure out how to best to work them together. Also, having Marcus Smart, figuring out how to use him and things like that. And just the way that that roster built and was operated, you can bring in Ime to this team and maybe have another year of, changing some things, but not going necessarily full rebuild like some people, not full rebuild, but not really sending away a lot of the top level pieces that people thought. So Ujiri did come out and also said, saying that, yeah, Scottie Barnes is going to be here. He's 21 years old, talking about that, saying that Jakob Poeltl, he has him as a top 10 center in this league, and they want to bring him back. So it seems like right now, the Toronto Raptors, the biggest change that they may make in the offseason, despite the conversations around, Fred VanVleet, and maybe he's going to come out of that contract and maybe go elsewhere. What do they look to trade OG Anunoby, things like that? And those things still may very well happen. But I think initially they're going to try to find the right head coach. They're going to sit down with, if that coach does end up being Ime Udoka, and try to figure out what his vision for this current roster is. Because if you feel like Udoka can come in and maybe get a little bit more out of this roster, right? Get a little bit more out of what this team has been, then at that point, maybe you do say, hey, let's maybe trade one of the pieces, right? Maybe we hold on to Fred VanVleet. Maybe it's just sending out Fred VanVleet and seeing if we can get something back, those type of things, right? I do think if I had to, in my heart of hearts, if I had to ask the question, I do think OG Anunoby may be the piece to move. I just don't necessarily see them moving Pascal Siakam. But again, having Jakob Poeltl, they could feel, especially if they truly do see him as a top 10 center in this league, maybe they do send out Pascal so they can get a lot back for him, because he could net a lot. And ultimately, really, at the end of the day, that they have a lot of players that if they do decide to move on, two of these players, they could get a lot back for, especially when you see the parity around the NBA, what it's been this season, and just how there are going to be teams that are going to jump at the fact to trade for one of these players because they may not think that they're that far away, even though in reality, they may be farther away than what their record has told them. So I'm going to see how it shakes down in this playoff run. But ultimately, when you just look at just how things have gone with the Raptors, right? Where things have gone right, where things have gone wrong. It really just comes down to they don't really have that one thing, right? They don't have that one piece you look at and you're like, hey, this is the guy to build around. They have a formula down there. They have pieces they can build around, but they don't have the guy yet. Scotty Barnes still could very well turn into that guy. I want to make sure that I say that. And Masai agrees with that. Seems like he is very high on that as well. But at the end of the day, right, until they have that guy that they feel like they are building that franchise around, you have to maybe look at it every year and say really, like, what do we have to change here to really up our chances, right? And so, the Toronto Raptors, who were eliminated by my Chicago Bulls in the play-in tournament, which, okay, cool. I look at it as really here nor there. Even if they would have won, I don't think anybody would have had the Toronto Raptors pegged to win a playoff series. So it kind of is what it is there. But they have things that they need to figure out. They have questions that they don't have the answer to as of right now. So we'll see what that means. The Toronto Raptors, they do have a lottery pick coming up in this draft. What that means for them ultimately, we'll see, right? If they use that, if they move that, do they package that with one of their players to bring in some more high-level talent there? But I also want to talk about this, right? Outside of just the Raptors, Ime Udoka coming in, I know he's rightfully so. Let me be clear here. Udoka is rightfully so probably looked at as the best head coaching candidate for any open position out there right now. When you look at what he did in Boston, he's earned that. He deserves it. I don't want to take it away from that. But my question is, how many questions are around? Was it Udoka as a coach who was a first-time head coach taking over that team? And how much of it is he just had the right roster? And that's not to say that Toronto still can't be the right roster for him. But considering Joe Mazzulla, another coach that was not a head coach of the NBA level before coming in and taking over that job, came in and they had basically the same exact success, right? You have to ask yourself, right? Is there enough doubt there, right, on what is he going to be the man to turn this Toronto Raptors franchise around, this roster around? Is he the guy to really do that? I'll say this. As a person who's a fan of the Chicago Bulls, I look at it and say I would love to have Ime Udoka on my team instead of Billy Donovan coaching it. So I know a lot of fan bases think that as well. But sometimes it's harder to get to really evaluate how much of it was the roster and how much of it was the coach. It's usually somewhere in between. And you have to ask yourself, the things that you weigh as being on the coach, is that enough to try to pull this Raptors team out of kind of this just mid area that they're in, right? This mid area that they're in. They're not a bad team by any stretch of the imagination. They're not a great team either. And so to do that, if you're going to keep most of this roster together, you have to have an amazing head coach that's going to come up with an amazing game plan to get the most out of this roster. And if Ime Udoka ends up being their hired head coach, the question that they got to ask themselves, is Udoka the guy who can get more out of this roster than maybe what we saw during the season? And if not, you have to start sending out assets to try to bring in other assets. So I expect this to be the first step in a long season, offseason for the Toronto Raptors. You guys can let me know what you guys think on everything down below. But that is it for me for today. Make sure you guys are following the show at NBA Central Show Pod. You can send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, NBA Central Show at gmail.com. And then lastly, if you want to leave a text message and our voicemail, the number to do so, 773-270-2799. And I'll see you guys the next time I feel like making a video, probably tomorrow. Peace, y'all.
This has been a presentation of the Breaks Media.